Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, let your thoughts drift gently as we take you on a peaceful journey. This is a space for calm, for quiet moments, and for the kind of stories that settle your heart and slow your breath. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes if you wish, and allow the world to soften around you. Now, let's begin with tonight's story. Today's story is titled Whispers Between Worlds, the Keeper of Stories. The room was quiet. Only the faint ticking of a clock on the wall, and the soft rustling of wind against the windows, reminded Ezra that time was still moving forward. He sat at the edge of a wide, comfortable bed inside a small adobe-style inn, nestled at the outskirts of a mountain town few had ever heard of. Ezra breathed in deeply. He had come here to disappear for a while, not in the dramatic sense, but more like someone trying to melt into the stillness of life after too much noise. As a cultural photographer who spent years rushing between city deadlines and airport terminals, Ezra had forgotten what it meant to pause. That was, until he'd arrived here drawn by something unexplainable. A whisper in a guidebook. A forgotten photograph in an old library. A story half heard and never fully understood. And so here he was, at the beginning of something he couldn't name. He stood, walked barefoot across the cool tile floor, and opened the wooden shutters. Warm light spilled into the room like honey, golden and soft. The world outside looked suspended in a timeless haze. The high mountain sun was rising slowly, brushing the rooftops with gentle fire. A breeze drifted in, carrying a hint of incense and marigolds. Ezra smiled faintly. That scent, he'd come to realize, would be his guide for the days ahead. But before all else, he needed to arrive not just in body, but in spirit. He returned to the bed and lay back, arms outstretched, gazing at the white ceiling. With a deep inhale through his nose, he closed his eyes and imagined a single ray of sunlight. In his mind's eye, it was pure and slow-moving, descending like a silk ribbon from above. Wherever it touched, it left warm. A tingling softness, like the very soul of light caressing the skin. It brushed his toes first, then his heels. Upward, it flowed through his ankles, calves, and knees. It loosened everything it touched. Tension slipped away unnoticed, like sand sliding between the cracks of an open palm. The light continued upward: waist, chest, neck. His breath deepened. His body sank heavier into the mattress. He felt his awareness shift gently, like being caught in a lullaby, or drifting just beneath the surface of a dream. This was not sleep. It was arrival. He imagined the light glowing in the center of his chest, pulsing in rhythm with his breath. He let it spread outward again across his shoulders, down to his fingertips, and finally upward, wrapping around his face like a warm cloth. Behind his eyelids, golden hues danced. Ezra let go of the thoughts trying to push through the noise of the world he left behind. Deadlines. Unanswered emails. Regrets. None of that mattered here. Instead, he thought of names he didn't yet know, of music he hadn't yet heard, of stories waiting beneath layers of language and centuries. And in this stillness, something whispered. Not a sound, but a knowing. You are exactly where you are meant to be. Time drifted away. Ezra wasn't sure how long he remained there, breathing with the sun, body open and free. But when he finally opened his eyes again, the golden light in the room felt different, richer, more alive. He sat up slowly, still half inside the quiet. There was movement outside. A figure, a woman in a bright shawl, was passing by with a basket of marigolds balanced on her hip. She smiled when she saw him through the window. "Buenos dias," she said, eyes sparkling. "Buenos dias," Ezra replied, his voice lower, softer. He had arrived. Tomorrow, or perhaps later today, he would begin his journey into the celebration that had brought him here, the Days of the Remembered, the town's local variation of Dia de los Muertos. But this was not the Day of the Dead he'd read about in brochures. No, this version was older. More intimate. Rooted not in spectacle, but in memory and warmth. For now, he let the scent of marigolds flood the room. He reached for his notebook and jotted down a single line. There are places in the world where the veil is thinner, and the light knows your name. He didn't know yet what that meant. But he would. The morning air was crisp with the scent of roasted maize and wood smoke. Ezra tightened the strap on his canvas bag, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped out onto the cobbled street. The town stretched before him in quiet anticipation, every corner whispering stories older than memory. He didn't need a map. The marigolds led the way. They lined the windowsills and clung to wooden door frames, their bright golden petals standing out like beacons. Children with orange-stained fingers ran giggling through narrow alleys, holding flowers like torches, chasing one another between shadow and sun. Ezra followed the winding road that led downhill toward the heart of the town. He turned a final corner, and there it was, the plaza. A vast square of green stretched out beneath the morning sun, its grass shimmering like emeralds scattered under glass. The plaza was flanked on all sides by white stucco buildings with dark wooden beams, red clay roofs, and balconies draped in papel picado, delicate banners of colored tissue paper fluttering in the breeze. Purple, orange, and deep red danced in the air above like the last breath of sunset. In the center of the plaza stood a tall stone fountain. Its water was still, glinting like a mirror. Around it, vendors began setting up for the day. Tables were being arranged in perfect lines, covered with bright woven cloths. Pots of tamales steamed gently in the corners. Stacks of sugar skulls, some smiling, others serene, waited in silence. Ezra stood motionless, trying to take it all in. A little girl with two long braids ran past him, nearly knocking over a basket filled with tiny marigold bouquets. "Lo siento," she called back, without stopping. Ezra smiled. From his vantage point near the fountain, he could see the town slowly waking. But there was something different here, something beneath the surface. It wasn't just a celebration. It was communion. People weren't rushing. They moved like they were part of a dance, slow, rhythmic, knowing. Old women lit candles at street altars with trembling hands. Men in white hats placed loaves of pan de muerto on steps leading up to a mural of saints and skeletons. Teenagers with painted faces helped younger children tie ribbons on tree branches, each ribbon bearing a name. Ezra felt a strange sensation wash over him, not dizziness, not fear, but a sudden sense of stepping into a place that existed between now and always. He looked around and noticed others like him, travelers, outsiders, seekers. Some stood quietly, camera lenses forgotten. Others knelt beside makeshift altars, leaving coins, bracelets, or even old photos. Ezra reached into his bag and pulled out the small leather notebook he always carried. He opened to a blank page, but didn't write. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the old church at the far end of the square. Its thick wooden doors were flung open, and soft music drifted out, violins and flutes, accompanied by a low hum like wind through pine trees. The bells had not yet rung, but something told him they would. Ezra crossed the plaza slowly, letting the sounds and colors sink into his bones. As he walked, he passed a man painting a skeleton couple dancing under the moon. Next to him, a teenage boy strummed a guitar with fingers so graceful it seemed he was conjuring magic rather than playing notes. And then he saw it. An enormous ofrenda had been built beside the church, standing nearly twice the height of a man. It was a layered altar, bursting with live flowers, candles, photographs, and bundles of fruit. Every step was draped in fabric the color of fire. At its peak sat a photo in a carved wooden frame, an old man in a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes smiling even in stillness. A family stood gathered nearby. No one spoke. They simply watched. Ezra felt the heaviness in the air, not sorrow, but presence. The kind of silence that vibrates with meaning. He took a step closer, and a middle-aged woman turned toward him. "You can come closer," she said softly in Spanish. "He would have liked to meet you." Ezra nodded, heart thudding gently in his chest. He didn't know the man in the photo, but something about this altar, the arrangement, the smells, the love woven into every corner felt familiar. Like walking into a story half remembered from childhood. He knelt before the altar and placed one of the marigolds he had picked earlier that morning on the bottom step. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. When he rose again, the woman smiled. "His name was Santiago," she said. "He loved music and mangoes. And he never missed a festival." Ezra smiled back. "I think I would have liked him." They stood together for a moment, and then she turned to rejoin her family. Ezra stepped back into the sunlight. The plaza was filling now. The air was warmer. The paper banners above him danced more wildly than before. The celebration had not yet begun in full, but something had shifted. A veil had lifted, if only slightly. Ezra knew he was no longer just an observer. He was inside the story now. and the story had just begun. Ezra woke the next morning before the sky had fully brightened. The soft hush of dawn wrapped around the town like a blanket, and outside his window, the marigolds glowed faintly in the dim light, as if they held the sun inside them, waiting to release it. He sat up slowly, unsure if he had dreamt the events of the day before. But the scent, earthy, sweet, laced with incense and bread, lingered in the air. And so did the feeling. That unmistakable sense that something unseen had passed near him, brushing against his soul like wind across a lake. He dressed quickly, grabbed his camera and notebook, and headed out before breakfast. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but his feet seemed to know. Down the alley, past the fountain, through a narrow street flanked by shops just beginning to stir. The world was still muted, suspended between night and day. As he reached the edge of the plaza, he saw them, dozens of small altars beginning to appear like mushrooms after rain. People worked in quiet concentration, building ofrendas outside their homes, on street corners, beneath trees. Some were simple, just candles, bread, and flowers. Others were elaborate towers of fabric and framed photos, sugar skulls, carved wooden figures, popple picado fluttering like prayer flags. Ezra paused near one that caught his attention. It was different. Not large or brightly colored. Just a single small table with a weathered photograph of a young boy no more than 8 or 9 grinning beside a mango tree. A wooden toy boat rested beside the frame, along with a little cup of chocolate milk. Something clenched in Ezra's chest. A woman, perhaps in her 60s, was adjusting a candle nearby. Her hands moved slowly, reverently. Ezra took a quiet step closer. "Es tu hijo?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes kind. "Si," she replied softly. "Si llamo Mateo. Le encantaba el río." Ezra nodded. "The river," he repeated, barely above a whisper. She smiled faintly. "He used to build boats from bark and race them with the other children. He always won." They stood in silence for a while. Ezra didn't ask how Mateo had died. It didn't feel necessary. What mattered was here, this altar, this morning, the offering of memory and love. Before leaving, he pulled a small wooden bird from his pocket, an ornament he had bought the day before, not knowing why. He set it beside the toy boat. "For the sky," he said. The woman's eyes glistened. "Gracias." Ezra walked on, heart heavier and fuller at once. The deeper he went into the town, the more ofrendas he saw, some with laughter, others with tears. They told stories in silence. A grandmother's hat and knitting needles. A soldier's faded dog tag. A baker's apron dusted in flour. So many lives folded into paper and firelight. By mid-morning, he reached the far side of town, where the houses thinned and the earth opened into gentle hills. There, overlooking the rooftops, stood an old chapel. It was modest, with peeling white paint and a bell that hadn't rung in years. But in front of it was a gathering. A group of villagers stood in a circle, each holding a marigold in one hand and a candle in the other. A man in a navy poncho stepped into the center. He raised his hands and began to speak, not loudly, but with a voice that carried like smoke. Ezra stood at the edge, listening. "We honor not only those who have passed," the man said, "but the silence they left behind. The stories they took with them. And the stories they left in us." He paused, holding his candle high. "Today, we walk with them. Not behind. Not in front. But side by side." The crowd repeated softly, "Lato Alato." Ezra felt a shiver crawl across his skin. The man lowered his arms. The group slowly began to move, not as a parade, not as a performance, but as a pilgrimage. Down the hill, into the heart of the town. A procession of the living and the dead. Ezra walked with them. He carried no flower, no candle. But he carried a question, one that had grown louder with each step he took since arriving here. What story do I carry? He didn't know the answer yet. But he knew this place would show him. That night, he returned to the plaza, now glowing with hundreds of flickering flames. The ofrendas had multiplied. Their light shimmered in windows, spilled onto sidewalks, reflected in the eyes of strangers turned family. Ezra sat by the fountain again, camera resting in his lap, untouched. Above him, the sky was black velvet, studded with stars. And between those stars, he felt it a presence, gentle and steady. As if someone he didn't know, remembered him. The road to Capula was a winding ribbon of dust and wildflowers. It curved through the low hills like a secret path known only to those who belonged. Ezra sat in the back of a shared transport van, shoulder to shoulder with local families carrying baskets of bread, jugs of water, and bags of fabric. A child beside him clutched a handmade doll with a stitched skeleton face, whispering songs into its ear. Ezra watched the landscape unfold through the window, his thoughts drifting like clouds. Capula. He had read the name once in a footnote of an old photography book, describing it as a village where pottery remembers the dead better than the living. He hadn't understood it then. But now, he felt the edges of that meaning pressing against him, asking to be known. The van creaked to a stop at the village entrance. As Ezra stepped out, a gust of warm air filled with the mingled scents of clay, spice, and wood smoke greeted him like an old friend. The streets were already alive, though it was still early. Capula was smaller than he expected. The buildings were simple adobe and brick, some painted in faded blues and sun-worn oranges. But what caught his attention were the murals. Every surface, walls, fences, shop fronts was a canvas. Skeletons danced on rooftops. Painted skulls grinned beside blooming roses. Couples embraced, their skeletal hands laced together as if they had never known death. And at the center of it all was her. La Katrina. She was everywhere. On ceramic plates, etched into tiles, stitched into fabric, drawn in chalk on the ground. Elegant and haunting, draped in purple and black, with flowers in her hair and pearls in her hollowed eyes. The Lady of the Dead, beautiful, eternal, and smiling. Ezra followed the flow of people down the narrow main street toward a large plaza where a makeshift stage had been erected. Around it, vendors sold hot tamales, skull-shaped candy, and hand-painted pottery in every shade of crimson and gold. A group of women stood near the fountain, adjusting their wide-brimmed hats and brushing lace skirts into place. Their faces were painted white, with black around the eyes and skeletal designs across their cheeks. But it wasn't gory. It was elegant. Reverent. As if the boundary between life and death were just another veil of silk. One woman noticed Ezra watching and winked at him. "La Katrina sees you," she teased in Spanish, her voice playful but layered. Ezra smiled. "I think she sees everyone." She nodded. "But only a few choose to see her back." The parade began at noon. It wasn't loud, not in the way city parades often are. There were no blaring horns or crashing drums. Instead, it moved with grace, a river of gowns and veils, swirling lace and painted smiles. Women of all ages walked the cobbled streets in solemn procession, embodying La Katrina with pride and purpose. Each woman carried something unique: a mirror, a single rose, a tiny skull, or a lantern. Ezra lifted his camera, but paused. It felt wrong to capture it as an outsider. This wasn't spectacle. It was inheritance. So instead, he lowered the lens and simply walked beside them. As he did, he began to see it, the deeper story. This wasn't about death. It was about memory. About reclaiming beauty from fear. About honoring the strength of those who had passed, especially the women who had built homes, carried children, survived wars, and woven entire villages together with nothing but wool and song. La Katrina wasn't a symbol of mourning. She was a reminder that dignity follows us beyond the grave. The parade ended at a courtyard where a contest would be held. A panel of elders sat at a long table, watching with eyes that knew too many stories. One by one, the Katrinas stepped forward, spinning, dancing, bowing. Laughter rang out. Tears shimmered in the corners of eyes. And then, silence. A girl stepped forward. No more than 10 years old, dressed in a simple black dress with marigold trim. Her face paint was imperfect, clearly done with a shaking hand. But she stood tall. And in her hands, she held a photo, weathered, creased, clearly loved. It was of an older woman with deep lines and kind eyes. "My abuela," the girl said. "She is the first Katrina I ever knew." No one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence was applause enough. Ezra felt something open inside him. Something old. Something unspoken. He remembered his own grandmother, how she used to sing lullabies in a language he never learned. How her hands smelled like soap and rosemary. How she always said, "Don't forget where you come from, even if you don't know where you're going." As the sun began its slow descent, Ezra wandered the market. He passed a vendor selling tiny figurines of La Katrina, each one unique, each one a miniature altar of artistry. He picked one, a dancing figure with a guitar slung across her skeletal back. "For your journey," the vendor said, wrapping it in tissue paper. Ezra didn't reply. He just nodded, clutching the little figure like it was a compass. That evening, as he walked back toward his inn, the painted bones of Capula faded behind him. But their song remained. Not loud. Just steady. Like a heartbeat echoing through stone. The next leg of Ezra's journey took him further south, away from the painted walls and bone-laced poetry of Capula, into the highland air that cradled the lake of Pátzcuaro. The road curved gently downward as if guiding travelers into the arms of something ancient and patient, something that waited, not with urgency, but with the soft persistence of memory. He arrived in the early afternoon, stepping off the bus onto a plaza pulsing with life. Unlike the quiet reverence of Capula, Pátzcuaro radiated a vibrant, living energy. The plaza, known as Plaza Vasco de Quiroga, sprawled like a green heart at the town's center, beating with the footsteps of artisans, musicians, and visitors from across the country. The sky above was a crisp blue canvas, scattered with drifting popol picado in fiery oranges and purples. They fluttered from every balcony, stretched like whispered prayers between lampposts. Ezra stood in the middle of it all, feeling very small and very welcome. He moved with the crowd toward the artisan stalls that spilled out into the plaza. Each one overflowed with colors, shapes, and textures. Hand-painted ceramic skulls smiled from rows of tables. Intricately woven fabrics rippled in the breeze. Tiny wooden coffins filled with dancing skeleton puppets. Sugar skulls dusted with shimmering sugar, decorated with names written in cursive icing. But what truly caught his attention were the Okomaiko figures. A vendor, an older man with deep laugh lines and hands stained with paint, noticed Ezra's pause and grinned. "Spirits in clay," he said proudly, pointing to the array of fantastical sculptures. "This one is a flying jaguar. And here, a skeleton dog riding a bicycle into the stars." Ezra leaned closer. Each piece was a story, mythical creatures tangled with human skeletons in surreal dances. Some smiled. Others mourned. All of them moved with a wild, unfiltered imagination. "What do they mean?" Ezra asked. The old man shrugged. "They mean what you see. Some say they keep the dead company. Others say they scare away what should stay dead. Either way, they remind us that death doesn't have to be still." Ezra bought a small Okomaiko devil with tiny wings and mischievous eyes. He placed it carefully in his satchel, not quite sure why it had called to him. The plaza continued to hum around him. A mariachi band set up near the steps of the old basilica, their silver-trimmed suits catching the light. As they began to play, the crowd swayed into motion. Couples danced. Children twirled with ribbons. An old woman tapped her cane to the rhythm, a marigold tucked behind her ear. Ezra found a bench in the shade and simply watched. A young boy approached, offering Panda Muerto from a woven basket. Ezra accepted a piece, warm and sweet, with a subtle scent of orange blossom and anise. As he bit into it, a strange wave of memory swept over him. He was a child again. At his grandmother's table. The smell of cinnamon and flour in the air. Her hands guiding his across dough, her voice humming something old. He blinked. The sensation faded. The boy had already darted off into the crowd. Ezra looked around, heart full and aching at once. The sun had begun its slow descent. Long shadows stretched across the plaza, and the lights around the basilica flickered to life. A large bonfire was being prepared in the far corner, surrounded by musicians tuning violins and guitars. Drawn by instinct, Ezra stood and wandered down a narrower street behind the plaza. There, tucked away between old stone walls and flowering vines, was a flower market. It was like stepping into another world. Marigolds, or champasa chill, blanketed the market in waves of fire. They cascaded from baskets, spilled across tables, and formed golden rivers along the ground. Women moved through the blossoms like spirits themselves, choosing stems with the precision of ritual. The air was thick with their scent, pungent, sweet, intoxicating. Ezra knelt beside a vendor, her fingers weaving marigold chains with speed and grace. "These flowers," he said softly, "they're for the dead." She looked up, smiling. "Yes. But also for us. We follow their path, just as they follow ours. These help them find their way. And remind us not to lose ours." Ezra purchased a small bouquet and cradled it in both hands. It felt heavier than flowers should, filled with meaning, with presence. As he made his way back toward the main plaza, twilight descended fully. The bonfire was now roaring, and music floated through the darkening sky. Dancers spun in the flickering light, casting long, shifting shadows across the church walls. And overhead, the stars began to bloom. Ezra stood still, bouquet in one hand, camera forgotten. This place, Pátzcuaro, wasn't just celebrating the dead. It was living with them. Side by side. Step by step. He understood now what the man in the chapel had meant: we don't walk ahead or behind. We walk together. Ezra closed his eyes for a moment and let the warmth of the fire and the marigolds wrap around him. He whispered a quiet promise to no one in particular, and perhaps to everyone. "I will remember. And I will carry your light." The morning after the fire-lit celebration in Pátzcuaro, Ezra awoke to the low toll of church bells echoing through the mist. The sound was slow, deliberate, like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. Outside his inn window, the cobbled street still held shadows, but the sun was climbing, dissolving the night inch by inch. Ezra stepped outside, bouquet of marigolds in hand, and made his way toward the church. The Basilica of Our Lady of Health loomed at the edge of the plaza, its stone face mottled with age and reverence. Ivy climbed its side like time made visible, and the heavy wooden doors stood wide open. Locals passed in and out quietly, their faces peaceful, their hands full, some carrying candles, others small bundles of food or framed photographs wrapped in linen. But Ezra was not drawn to the church just yet. He followed the scent. Around the side of the building, through an archway worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, he entered the flower market. And the world changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't bustling. But it was full. Full of scent and color and something he could only describe as devotion made tangible. The marigolds were everywhere. He'd seen them before on altars, in the streets, along balconies, but here they were concentrated, multiplied, alive. Orange, gold, flame yellow. Some as large as his palm, others delicate like lace. Bundled into wreaths, tied with twine, shaped into arches, crowns, paths. They glowed in the morning light, catching fire with every movement of the breeze. Vendors worked in calm rhythm, arranging flowers into bundles, weaving necklaces, or braiding long chains meant to drape over doorways and gravestones. A young girl sat cross-legged beside a pile of petals, threading them one by one into a garland longer than her arms could stretch. Ezra wandered slowly through the aisles, cameras slung but untouched. He wasn't here to document. He was here to feel. He stopped beside an older man wrapping marigold bundles in thin paper. The man looked up, his weathered face crinkling into a gentle smile. "For the altars?" Ezra asked. The man nodded. "And for the path," he replied. "The spirits come home tonight. They need to find their way." Ezra looked down at the petals. "And this guides them." The man gestured toward the sky. "Marigolds hold the sun. Even in the dark." Ezra bought a string of them. It was warm in his hands, surprisingly heavy, like it carried more than weight, like it carried longing. He wandered deeper. At the heart of the market stood a long table filled with more than just flowers. There were small clay bowls of copal resin, bundles of herbs, hand-folded paper butterflies, and vases with floating candles. Everything designed with purpose. Nothing wasted. At one stall, a woman was painting petals with words, names, wishes, tiny prayers. Her hands moved carefully, as though she feared bruising the memories they held. Ezra watched as she set one painted petal aside. It read, "Para mi madre, que canta con los pajaros," for my mother, who sings with the birds. He felt a lump rise in his throat. In a moment of impulse, he stepped forward. "Could I write one?" he asked. The woman nodded, handing him a blank petal and a small brush. Ezra stared at it for a long time. The petal trembled slightly in his palm. Then, slowly, he wrote, "To the one I lost before I learned how to say goodbye." The woman took it gently from him, added it to a bowl of others, and placed a marigold bloom on top. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Ezra left the market with his string of flowers and the quiet weight of what he'd just released. Outside, the plaza had grown brighter, but softer. The morning light seemed filtered through memory. Children now ran with garlands like streamers. Old men sat on benches tying marigold bundles to walking sticks. Young women braided flowers into their hair, their eyes distant, as if they were speaking with ghosts only they could see. Ezra walked back toward the basilica steps and sat beneath a stone archway. He let the garland rest across his knees and closed his eyes. He saw the road behind him, Capula's murals, the bone-painted dancers, the Okamiko figures grinning like dreams gone wild. And he saw ahead the lake that waited, the island shrouded in stories, the night of the candles drawing near. But here was the breath between. The in-between space. The pause before the veil is pulled back. And it smelled like marigolds. He sat there for a long while. Not taking pictures. Not taking notes. Just breathing. Just remembering. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the town of Pátzcuaro. Ezra stood at the edge of the lake, watching the water ripple gently beneath a sky tinged with gold. The sound of distant church bells echoed faintly, mixing with the quiet murmurs of the town as the Day of the Dead celebration began to approach its peak. He had spent the morning wandering the flower market, feeling as if he had stumbled upon a part of life that most people passed by too quickly. But now, as the sun began to sink lower, he knew it was time to visit the heart of the celebration, the Basilica of Our Lady of Hell, and the gathering that would take place at the churchyard. The crowds had thinned, but the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The streets were lined with glowing candles, each one a beacon of memory, a symbol of connection between the living and the dead. Marigolds still filled the air with their heady fragrance, and the occasional burst of laughter or conversation drifted from the houses. Ezra followed the path leading from the plaza to the old church. The sun was now setting, the golden light spilling over the rooftops, bathing the town in a soft, amber glow. There was something about the way the light seemed to hold on to everything in Pátzcuaro as if it didn't want to let go. The entrance to the basilica was quiet, the stone steps worn smooth from years of worshippers ascending them, some with joy, others with grief. Ezra climbed them slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The doors to the church were open, and inside, the soft light of hundreds of candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. As he stepped into the church, a sense of stillness descended around him. The air was thick with the smell of copal incense, and the faint hum of a guitar floated from a corner of the room. The sounds of the outside world seemed muffled here, as if time had slowed down and folded in on itself. At the front of the church was an altar, covered in flowers, candles, and offerings. It was an ofrenda, an altar dedicated to those who had passed, where families came to place their loved ones' favorite foods, drinks, photographs, and personal items. Each item was a memory, a way of welcoming the spirits back into the world of the living, even if just for one night. Ezra approached the altar, his footsteps soft on the stone floor. He paused at the edge of the altar, looking at the photographs of people long gone, their eyes frozen in time but their lives still felt in every corner of the room. The marigolds, the candles, and the flickering light seemed to transform the space into something sacred, something beyond the physical realm. He knelt in front of the altar and closed his eyes, letting the stillness of the church settle around him. It felt as though the veil between the worlds had thinned, and in this moment, he could almost hear the whispers of the souls who had crossed over. They were there, just beyond the light, walking beside the living, part of the world and yet separate from it. Ezra opened his eyes, feeling a strange pull at his chest. He reached into his bag and pulled out the small figure of La Katrina he had bought in Capula. The ceramic figure, with its elaborate dress and painted skull, seemed to pulse with life in the flickering candlelight. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a connection, a reminder that death, too, was a part of life, a part of the journey that everyone must take. He placed the figure on the altar, alongside the photographs and offerings, as if to say, "I see you. I remember you." For a long time, he sat there, lost in the quiet and the light. Around him, the church slowly filled with people, families and friends coming to light candles, to share stories, to laugh and to mourn. The air was filled with the soft hum of voices, the rustle of paper and flowers, and the warmth of candles flickering like stars. As the night deepened, the sound of music began to rise. A guitar played, followed by the sweet melody of violins and flutes. The music was slow, melancholic, but not sad, more like a lullaby for the dead, a song of remembrance, a celebration of the journey that everyone must take. Ezra stood up from his place at the altar, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. He stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling the lightness in his chest. He had come here to find something, to understand something that had been missing from his life. And now, in this moment, he realized that he had found it. The stars were brighter now, hanging low in the sky, like candles guiding the way. The sound of music and laughter drifted across the plaza as families began to gather around the ofrendas, lighting candles, sharing memories, and celebrating the lives of those who had passed. Ezra walked slowly through the plaza, his camera at his side, not needing to capture the moment, but to experience it. He had come here to understand the Day of the Dead, and now he knew that it wasn't about mourning or fear. It was about connection. It was about remembering. And it was about living. As he walked past an altar adorned with candles, he paused for a moment, feeling the warmth on his face. He placed his hand gently on the table, where the flickering candlelight illuminated a photograph of a woman, her face serene and wise. "She's here too," Ezra whispered softly to the night. "I feel you." And with that, he continued his walk, the music of the night carrying him forward, as the stars above, like marigolds, continued to light the way. The boat creaked gently as it bobbed in the cool waters of Lake Pátzcuaro. Ezra sat near the edge, his feet just skimming the surface, watching the small ripples ripple outward. The night had fallen deep, and the lake stretched out like an endless black mirror beneath the sky. In the distance, the island of Janitzio loomed like a shadow, its silhouette barely visible against the sky. The boat was filled with people, locals and visitors alike, each with a candle held carefully in their hands, casting soft, trembling light across the water. The air was cool, crisp, with the scent of the lake and the faint trace of incense still lingering in the wind. Ezra could hear the whispers of the others around him, but it felt as though the water itself was speaking. The waves lapped quietly against the sides of the boat, carrying with them the weight of centuries of memories. As the boat moved farther from the shore, the lights of Pátzcuaro faded into the distance. The only illumination now came from the small flickering candles, their flames dancing in the night air. Ezra felt a strange sensation, as if the boat was not just crossing the water, but moving between worlds. The soft murmur of the water seemed to whisper stories of those long gone, the souls of ancestors who had crossed this very lake in centuries past. Janitzio grew larger as they approached, its narrow streets winding upward toward the towering monument at the peak of the island. Ezra could see the faint outlines of families gathering along the shore, setting up altars, lighting candles, and preparing for the evening's vigil. The island was alive with the energy of the departed, and Ezra could feel it, an electric, quiet pulse beneath the surface of everything. When the boat reached the shore, Ezra stepped out onto the wet stone, his feet sinking into the cool earth. The island was peaceful, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Small altars lined the streets, each one different: a photograph of a grandfather beside a bowl of fruit, a pair of old shoes beside a faded letter, a glass of tequila beside a pair of hand-carved wooden figures. He wandered slowly, not wanting to disturb the sacredness of the moment. The air was thick with incense and marigolds, the scent so strong it seemed to fill his chest. He passed a family sitting together, their hands clasped in prayer, their faces solemn but full of love. Ezra paused at one of the altars, the sight of it pulling him in. It was simple, yet beautiful. A photograph of a man, smiling broadly, sat at the center, surrounded by candles and marigold petals. His image was framed by a tapestry of cloth, stitched with tiny patterns of flowers and vines. The altar was lit by the soft glow of the candles, and the man's face seemed to come alive in the light. Ezra felt a sudden, strange connection to this man, even though he had never met him. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about the way the flames flickered, the way the marigolds glowed, that made it feel like the man's presence was there, standing just beyond the altar. He reached into his bag, pulling out the small figure of La Katrina that he had bought in Capula. He placed it gently beside the photograph, the porcelain figure looking like a reflection of the man, dressed in a simple, elegant gown, her face painted with delicate lines. Ezra stood there for a long moment, his mind quieting, as if listening to something just beyond the veil. The sound of the wind through the trees, the soft murmur of voices, the distant sound of music, it all seemed to blend together into one harmonious whole, a lullaby for the dead and the living alike. After a while, Ezra stood up and began to make his way toward the towering monument at the top of the island. It was said to be the symbol of the town, built in honor of Morelos, the hero of the War of Independence. But as Ezra walked through the narrow, winding streets, it became clear that the monument was more than that. It was a beacon, a point of connection between worlds. At the top, the monument rose high into the night sky, casting a long shadow over the island. Ezra stood before it for a moment, feeling the weight of history in the air. He looked out over the lake, where the candles on the boats below flickered like a sea of stars. This place Genizio, Pátzcuaro, was not just a town, not just a celebration. It was a living memory, a place where the dead walked among the living, where the past and present coexisted in harmony. It was a reminder that death was not an end, but a continuation, a connection to something larger than the individual. Ezra closed his eyes and let the moment wash over him. He had come here seeking something, answers, perhaps, or just a sense of peace, but now he realized that what he had found was something far more precious, the understanding that life, death, and memory were threads in a tapestry woven by time itself. And in that tapestry, Ezra realized, he was not just an observer. He was part of the weave. As the night grew deeper and the candles flickered around him, Ezra made his way back down to the shore, where the boats awaited to carry the people back to Pátzcuaro. He climbed aboard, his heart full, and as the boat set off across the lake once more, he knew that this place, the island, the town, the memories would stay with him forever. The boat gently rocked as Ezra crossed back to Pátzcuaro, the island of Genizio slowly fading into the distance, swallowed by the dark expanse of Lake Pátzcuaro. The flickering lights of the other boats seemed like floating stars, tracing lines across the water as they drifted toward the shore. In the silence, the only sounds were the soft lapping of the waves against the boat's hull, and the occasional murmur of voices from fellow travelers. Ezra sat still, lost in thought, watching the stars above, feeling both connected to the universe and profoundly small. He had entered a world of rituals, of memories, of a people who didn't fear death but embraced it as part of life's ongoing journey. The Day of the Dead wasn't just about honoring the past, it was a celebration of the eternal thread that connected all souls, the living, the dead, and those yet to be born. The boat's lanterns flickered as they neared the shore. Ezra could see the soft glow of the town ahead, but it wasn't the bustling of crowds or the sounds of music that drew him in now. It was something quieter, a call to pause and reflect. As the boat docked, Ezra stepped onto the stone pier, his heart heavy yet full. There was a different energy in the air now, a shift, as if the day had passed and with it, something profound had occurred. The town had transformed in the night. Every home now seemed to glow, candles burning in every window, along every balcony, at every doorstep. He walked slowly through the streets, retracing his steps from earlier. The air was cool, the earth underfoot damp with dew. The scent of marigolds and copal filled the night, intoxicating and sacred. He came to a small street, where the sounds of laughter and conversation seemed to rise from within the walls of the homes, where families had gathered together, some to share food, others to light incense or offer prayers. The streets were quieter now, with the heavy silence that accompanies nightfall, but the presence of the dead was undeniable. Ezra stopped in front of an ofrenda that had caught his eye earlier, a simple table adorned with marigold petals, a photograph of a man with dark, kind eyes, and an old wooden box. He bent down to touch the surface, feeling the warmth from the candles, hearing the soft crackling of the flames. A figure stepped beside him, and Ezra turned to find an elderly man, dressed in worn but elegant clothing, watching him quietly. His eyes were kind, yet there was a depth to them, a quiet understanding. "Who is this man?" Ezra asked softly, gesturing to the photograph on the altar. The elderly man smiled, his voice low but strong. "My brother," he said. "He left us many years ago, but tonight, he returns home, just as the rest of us do." Ezra stood in silence, his gaze drifting from the photograph to the items on the altar, small mementos of a life well lived. The wooden box, now open, revealed what appeared to be a few old letters and some carefully folded clothes. "Did you know him well?" Ezra asked after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. The elderly man nodded slowly. "He was always the quiet one, the dreamer. But he taught me a great deal. He showed me the value of remembering, of cherishing the moments we have with those we love. I see his presence here, in every petal, in every candle flame. He is still with us." Ezra felt a weight settle in his chest, a gentle ache that seemed to resonate with something deep within him. He had never been one for rituals, for looking back or dwelling on loss. But here, in this town, surrounded by the gentle hum of remembrance, he could feel the pulse of life itself, its cycles, its inevitability. Life and death were not opposites but partners, moving together through time. Ezra reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook, which had become a trusted companion on this journey. He opened it to a blank page and, with the pen in his hand, began to write. Slowly at first, the words felt heavy, but they began to flow as the flickering candles cast long shadows on the page. The living and the dead are never far apart. They simply dwell in different rooms of the same house. The door between them is never locked, only opened when we are ready to listen. The elderly man stood beside him for a long time, silent, until Ezra finished writing. Then, the old man placed his hand gently on Ezra's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for remembering with us." Ezra nodded, his words lost for a moment, but his heart full. He closed his notebook and stood up. The air was still heavy with the scent of marigolds, and the town had taken on a new glow. Not from the candles or the lanterns, but from something deeper, something that Ezra couldn't quite define. It was the feeling of belonging, of connection, of the knowledge that he was not alone. He turned and walked slowly back to the center of the plaza, where the lights from the church illuminated the night. He paused at the edge of the fountain, watching as people drifted by, carrying candles, flowers, and memories. He was a part of this now, this web of remembrance that stretched across generations, a story that was never truly finished. The stars above began to twinkle more brightly, and Ezra realized that the night wasn't just about honoring those who had passed. It was about honoring the living, too, about recognizing the moments that connected them all. Life and death were two sides of the same coin, and the only way to truly understand one was to embrace the other. As he stood there, the music of the town drifting in the distance, Ezra felt the quiet pull of something greater. He had come to Pátzcuaro seeking answers. But now, he understood that the answers were not found in words, but in the stories shared, the memories held close, and the candles lit in the dark. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the evening wrap around him. In this moment, He was not an observer. He was a part of the story. Ezra wandered further into the heart of Pátzcuaro, drawn by the sounds of distant laughter and the crackling of bonfires. The town was alive in a way he had never experienced before. It wasn't the usual hustle of a celebration, it wasn't about joy in the way a festival often is. This was something quieter, more profound, a celebration that reached deep into the bones of the people, into the land itself. As he walked, the flickering flames of candles cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Every home he passed had an ofrenda, each altar a testimony to the lives that had come before. The air was thick with the scent of marigolds, incense, and the subtle earthy smell of the town's clay buildings. Ezra's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice calling from a nearby doorway. "Vasile," a woman's voice beckoned, her tone warm and inviting. He turned toward the sound, stepping closer to a small house on the corner. An older woman stood in the doorway, her face lined with age but lit by a smile that radiated kindness. She held a small basket of marigolds, and her eyes twinkled with a quiet energy. "Come in," she said again, her hand gesturing toward the open door. "We are waiting for the return." Ezra hesitated for a moment, but something in her invitation felt familiar, like a quiet tug from within his chest. He stepped forward, entering her home without a word, as if his feet knew the path. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of candles arranged in small clusters on tables and shelves. The air was thick with the scent of incense, sweet and smoky. A few wooden chairs were scattered around the room, and in the center, a large table stood, covered with an array of offerings: fruit, bread, a jug of water, and photographs. The woman set her basket down and motioned for Ezra to sit. "You are a traveler," she observed kindly, her eyes scanning him with an understanding that seemed to go deeper than what she could see. "But even travelers find their way home, sometimes." Ezra sat down, his heart suddenly heavy with something he couldn't explain. The house was warm, and for a moment, it felt like the whole world had paused. The sound of distant voices carried in from the street, but here, it was quiet, as if the room itself was holding its breath. "I've seen the way you walk," the woman continued, her voice like a soft murmur. "Not with haste. Not with fear. You walk with memory, don't you?" Ezra nodded, though he didn't know exactly how to answer. He hadn't realized it until now, but she was right. He had walked the streets of Pátzcuaro with a strange sense of familiarity, as if the places he passed had once existed in his mind, long before he ever set foot here. As if his soul had been here before, tracing these same steps in another life. The woman smiled knowingly. "The dead do not always leave. They walk with us, in the shadows of our thoughts, in the scent of marigolds, in the flame of a candle." She stepped toward the table and began to rearrange the offerings, gently adjusting the candles and moving a photograph. Ezra watched her, his heart aching with a gentle sorrow. He couldn't help but wonder how many times she had done this, how many times she had lit candles, spoken to the shadows, and invited those who had gone before back into her home. "It's not always about letting go," she said softly, as if reading his thoughts. Sometimes, it's about finding a way to walk together. Ezra stood up and walked over to the table. He picked up one of the photographs, an old black and white picture of a man, smiling broadly. He didn't know the man, but there was something about the photograph that felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for him to see it. "Is this your husband?" Ezra asked, turning to the woman. She nodded, her smile softening. "No, not my husband. My brother. He passed away many years ago. But tonight, he returns home." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "We wait for him, just as we wait for all of them. They are never truly gone, you know." Ezra looked at the photograph again, the man's face full of life and warmth, and for the first time since arriving in Pátzcuaro, he felt the deep ache of loss, the loss of people he had never known, yet somehow felt connected to. The woman took his hand gently, her grip firm but kind. "We all have a story, traveler," she said, her voice full of quiet wisdom. "And when the night comes, we are all bound by the same story. The living, the dead, and those yet to come. We are all part of this journey." Ezra's eyes lingered on the altar, the photographs, the candles, and the marigolds. He felt something stir deep within him, a realization, perhaps, or a quiet understanding. He had come to Pátzcuaro to learn, to understand what the Day of the Dead truly meant. But now, he realized that it wasn't just a celebration of death. It was a celebration of the lives that continued, the stories that never truly ended. The woman's eyes softened as she looked at him. "Would you like to wait with us?" she asked, motioning to the empty chairs around the table. "We light our candles, and we wait for the spirits to return. It's not a sad wait. It's a joyful one." Ezra nodded, his heart full of a quiet kind of peace. He sat down at the table, and together, they lit the candles. The woman spoke softly in a language Ezra didn't understand, but he didn't need to. He could feel the words in the air, in the flicker of the flames, in the scent of the marigolds. And for the first time, he understood. He wasn't just an observer. He was part of this story. Part of this celebration. Part of the world that moved between the living and the dead. As the candles burned low, the world outside seemed to fade. The town of Pátzcuaro became a distant memory, and Ezra found himself lost in the quiet beauty of the moment, surrounded by stories, by memories, by lives that had never truly left. The night had grown deeper, the stars now blazing above Pátzcuaro like 1,000 distant candles. Ezra sat at the small table with the elderly woman, the warmth of the candles flickering softly around them. The town had slowed, its hustle quieted by the reverence of the moment. There was no rush. No urgency. Just the steady rhythm of breath, of memory, of honoring what was once and what would one day be again. The flames cast long shadows against the walls of the room, stretching like fingers reaching across time. The marigolds at the altar swayed gently, their petals shimmering with an almost ethereal glow, as if the flowers themselves were alive with the presence of the spirits. The woman beside Ezra whispered something in a language he couldn't understand, her voice soft but steady. It wasn't a prayer exactly, but a quiet call to those who had crossed over, inviting them home. The words were ancient, their cadence like a lullaby, both soothing and deeply resonant. Ezra watched the light of the candles dance on her face, her features softened by the flickering glow. She didn't speak much more, and neither did he. Instead, they sat together in the peaceful silence, waiting for something he couldn't name, waiting for the return of the spirits, for the fleeting moments when the veil between worlds seemed to thin. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Ezra wasn't sure. Time didn't seem to matter here, not with the soft murmur of the woman's prayers and the quiet presence of the altar in front of them. It was as if the entire world had stopped for this one moment, as if life and death had found a brief space to meet. And then, the door opened. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a creak of wood, the faintest rustle of the outside air. But as the door opened wider, a cool breeze filled the room, carrying with it the scent of marigolds and something more, a presence, like the world itself had shifted. Ezra turned to the woman, who had already stood. She was smiling softly, a knowing glint in her eye. "They've returned," she said, her voice filled with warmth and welcome. The room seemed to grow stiller, quieter, the air thick with the weight of something unspoken. Ezra stood, too, and turned to face the door. Outside, the town was bathed in the soft glow of candles. The streets were lined with families, each gathered around their own ofrendas, lighting candles, offering food, and sharing memories. The music from the nearby plaza had softened, blending with the wind, creating a symphony of sounds that felt timeless. But it wasn't the music that caught Ezra's attention. It was the people. They began to emerge from the shadows of the streets, walking slowly, deliberately, like ghosts coming from another world. Their faces were soft, but familiar. Some of them smiled at Ezra, others simply passed by, their presence quiet but undeniable. They weren't just walking through the streets, they were walking through time itself. Ezra felt a strange pull, as if his feet were no longer his own, as if the world was urging him to follow, to step into the shadows where the living and the dead met. Without thinking, he walked toward the edge of the room, toward the open door, and stepped outside. The woman followed him silently, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Together, they stood in the doorway, watching the people as they passed. "They return every year," the woman said softly. "But it's not always clear who they are. Some walk beside us, and we don't know it. Some have left long ago, but their presence remains. In the air, in the marigolds, in the candlelight." Ezra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. The air was thick with the memories of the past, the lives that had touched this place, and the spirits who had returned to be remembered. It was as if the entire town, the entire world, was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything, life, death, and memory came together. A small group of children ran past, laughing, their faces painted like skeletons, their hands holding candles high. They danced around the altars, their laughter ringing out like music in the still night. Ezra watched them for a moment, the innocence of their joy filling him with a quiet sense of peace. The living, the dead both were present in this place, both part of the same journey. The woman beside him spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the way it has always been. The dead walk with us, and we walk with them. In the moments between, in the spaces where the veil is thin, we are one." Ezra didn't reply. Instead, he watched as the shadows moved around him, the figures of the departed walking past him, their faces soft with memories. Some were familiar, others strangers. But all of them shared the same quiet grace. As the night deepened, the people of the town began to gather at the church, the plaza now filled with light and sound. Ezra followed, feeling the pull of the community, feeling the weight of the stories that surrounded him. The music grew louder, and the people danced in the streets, their feet moving in rhythm with the earth, as if honoring the lives they had lost and the lives they still carried with them. Ezra didn't take out his camera. He didn't need to. This wasn't a moment for capturing, but for experiencing. The spirits of Pátzcuaro were alive in the air, in the marigolds, in the music. They weren't just memories, they were here, walking among the living. And for the first time, Ezra felt truly at home. Not just in this town, but in the world itself. The connection between life and death, the living and the dead, was a thread that wove through everything. And in that thread, Ezra found his place. As he stood in the plaza, surrounded by the dancing, the music, and the flickering candlelight, he realized that this was the true meaning of Dia de los Muertos. Not just to honor the dead, but to honor the living, to remember that we are all part of the same story, walking side by side through time. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of marigolds and the whispers of those who had come before. And as the night deepened, Ezra smiled, knowing that this moment, this connection would stay with him forever. The night in Pátzcuaro had settled in like an old, familiar song. The streets were alive with music, with laughter, with the soft murmur of voices and the gentle shuffle of feet on cobblestones. Ezra stood near the fountain in the center of the plaza, watching as the people moved around him, each one carrying the weight of their own memories, their own stories. The candles that lit the path seemed to glow brighter now, as if they held more than just wax and fire. They held the presence of the dead, the warmth of those who had passed but had never truly left. The marigolds, too, shimmered in the light, their petals a golden fire against the night. They were more than just flowers, they were the bridges between worlds, the waypoints that guided the spirits back to the places they had loved. Ezra felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was as though the veil between life and death had thinned so much that it had become translucent, and he could see beyond it not just the spirits of those who had passed, but the connections they still held with the living. It was a revelation, a quiet understanding that washed over him like the cool lake breeze. He turned to find the elderly woman from earlier standing nearby, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby candle. She had joined the gathering silently, as if part of the night itself, and she smiled at him as he met her gaze. "The spirits are here," she said softly, her voice barely above the hum of the music. "They walk among us tonight, not as ghosts, but as part of us. They walk in the steps of the living, in the rhythm of the music, in the laughter of children." Ezra nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had come to Pátzcuaro seeking understanding, seeking to learn the true meaning of Dia de los Muertos, and now, standing here among the living and the dead, he realized that it was not just a ritual or a celebration. It was a way of life, a way of remembering that honored the past while embracing the present. The woman turned and gestured for him to follow her. "Come, let us walk with them." They moved through the crowd, Ezra following quietly as she led him to the edge of the plaza, where the candles burned brighter, where the air seemed thicker with memory. He felt the change as soon as he crossed the threshold, an undeniable shift, as if stepping into a space that existed outside of time. Here, the people were not just celebrating. They were living with the dead. The ofrendas, the candles, the marigolds, all were not just for remembrance, but for communion. The dead were not separated from the living, they walked together, side by side, in this shared space. Ezra watched as families gathered around their altars, lighting candles, placing photographs, and sharing stories. He could hear snippets of conversation, stories about lost loved ones, memories of laughter, of moments that had shaped their lives. He could hear the joy in their voices, the way they spoke of those who had passed as if they were still with them, still part of the fabric of their lives. The elderly woman stopped at one of the altars, a small, humble table adorned with a single candle, a photograph, and a bowl of fruit. She placed a marigold in the center of the table and looked up at Ezra. "This was my mother's altar," she said softly. "She passed many years ago, but she is here with us tonight." Ezra glanced at the photograph, a black and white image of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The woman's face, though faded with time, seemed to radiate warmth, as if the memory of her still lived in the room. "She's still with you," Ezra said, his voice filled with quiet awe. The woman nodded. "In every flower, in every song, in every moment that we remember her." Ezra stood still for a long time, staring at the altar. It was simple, but it held so much love, so much life, so much memory. And it was not just a tribute to the past. It was a living testament, a place where the dead and the living met, where they shared a connection that transcended time. He reached out and touched the marigold, the petals soft against his fingers. For a moment, he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the flower, feeling the presence of the spirits that surrounded him. He didn't need to understand everything. He didn't need to explain it all. He simply needed to be here, to be part of this moment, to walk alongside the living and the dead. The woman turned to him with a gentle smile. "Tonight, we honor them. But we also honor ourselves. We honor the living, who carry the memories of the dead, who keep their stories alive." Ezra nodded slowly. "I understand now," he said, his voice soft. It's not just about remembering the past. It's about carrying it forward. It's about living with them, with the memories and the love they left behind. The woman smiled, her eyes filled with quiet wisdom. Yes. And it is through this living that we are able to honor the dead, not in sorrow, but in joy, in love, in memory. Ezra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He looked around at the people in the plaza, at the families, the children, the elders, all gathered together, all part of this shared celebration. The spirits walked among them, not as ghosts, but as part of their lives, part of their hearts. And in that moment, Ezra realized that the connection between life and death was not a divide, but a bridge, one that linked the living to the dead, the past to the present, and the memories of those who had come before to the lives of those who would come after. He looked up at the sky, the stars now shining brightly above him, and smiled. He had found what he had been searching for, not an answer, but a truth. A truth that would stay with him, guiding him, for the rest of his life. The night was at its deepest now, and the stars above Pátzcuaro shone with an intensity that Ezra had never seen before. The air was cool, filled with the soft whisper of the wind, and the scent of marigolds and incense lingered like a memory. It was the final night of Dia de los Muertos, the night when the spirits would return to the world of the living, even if just for a fleeting moment. Ezra stood on the edge of the plaza, watching as families and friends gathered around their altars, lighting candles, offering food, and sharing stories. The town was alive with the energy of remembrance, the connection between the past and the present made tangible in every flickering candle, every whispered prayer. It was as if time itself had slowed, allowing the living and the dead to exist in the same space, together. Ezra could feel it now, the presence of the spirits. It wasn't something he could see, but it was something he could sense. They were there, walking among the living, sharing in the joy and sorrow, in the memories and the love. The elderly woman from earlier appeared at his side again, her face soft with the wisdom of years and the quiet strength of someone who had witnessed both life and death in all their forms. She stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It is almost time," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with a quiet reverence. "The spirits will return home tonight. And we, the living, must be ready to welcome them." Ezra nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had come here searching for answers, for understanding. And now, as the night unfolded around him, he realized that the true meaning of Dia de los Muertos was not just about honoring the dead, but about embracing the cycle of life, about understanding that life and death are not opposites but parts of the same story. The woman gestured toward the church, where the lights had begun to flicker, casting long shadows across the stone steps. "We will walk together," she said, and without another word, she led him toward the church. As they entered the churchyard, the air seemed to change. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt sacred. The courtyard was filled with people, all standing in silence, their eyes fixed on the altar in front of the church. The altar was simple but beautiful, covered in marigolds, candles, and photographs. It was a place where the living and the dead could meet, a place where memories and love could transcend time. Ezra felt a sense of peace as he stood there, surrounded by the quiet reverence of the people. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to do anything. He just needed to be present, to honor the moment, to honor the spirits that were with them. The woman stood beside him, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes closed. Ezra followed her lead, closing his own eyes and taking a deep breath. The air felt thick with the weight of the moment. He could feel the presence of the spirits now, not just around him but inside him, as if they were walking beside him, guiding him. It was then that the bells of the church began to toll. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through Ezra's chest. Each toll of the bell seemed to mark the passing of time, the arrival of the spirits. With each chime, he felt the veil between worlds grow thinner, the boundary between the living and the dead become less distinct. And then, as the final toll of the bell faded into the night, there was a silence, a stillness that filled the air like a prayer. Ezra opened his eyes, and for the briefest moment, he saw them. The spirits. They moved through the crowd like shadows, their faces soft with remembrance. Some of them were familiar, others were strangers, but they all shared the same quiet grace. They were not ghosts, not specters. They were something more, something eternal. They were the memories, the love, the lessons that had been passed down through generations. Ezra watched as the spirits walked through the crowd, their forms flickering in the candlelight. They did not speak, but their presence was felt, as if they were communicating through the very air, through the flicker of the flames, through the scent of the marigolds. He felt a hand on his shoulder, and turned to see the elderly woman smiling softly at him. "They have returned," she said quietly. "Not just tonight, but always. The spirits never truly leave. They are part of us, part of our stories, part of our memories. They walk with us, side by side, through the paths of life." Ezra nodded, his heart full. He understood now. He understood that the spirits were not separate from them, but part of the very fabric of their lives. They were the ones who had come before, the ones who had shaped the world, the ones who had left a mark on history, on love, on memory. As the night deepened and the candles flickered low, Ezra felt a deep sense of peace. He had come to Pátzcuaro seeking something answers, perhaps. But what he had found was something far more precious, the understanding that life and death are not separate, but intertwined, like the marigold petals that fall and rise again with the seasons. He looked around at the people, their faces soft with the quiet understanding that comes only through memory, through shared stories. And as the bells of the church rang out once more, he realized that the journey he had begun here in Pátzcuaro had come full circle. The living and the dead were not two separate things. They were the same. And in that realization, Ezra felt something deep inside him shift. He wasn't just a visitor anymore. He was part of the story. Part of the tapestry of life and death that had been woven together for centuries. And as the night came to a close, and the candles burned low, Ezra knew that he would carry this understanding with him forever. The spirits of Pátzcuaro would walk with him, side by side, just as they walked with everyone who had ever lived. The morning after the final night of Dia de los Muertos, Ezra woke with the soft light of dawn breaking through the window, casting a warm glow across the room. The town of Pátzcuaro had begun to stir again, its streets now quiet, but still rich with the energy of the night before. The echoes of music and laughter had faded, but the connection between the living and the dead remained, woven into the fabric of the town, into the very air itself. Ezra sat up slowly, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of the experience still lingering in his chest. The night had been transformative, he could feel it deep within his bones. He had come to Pátzcuaro as an observer, seeking understanding, seeking answers about life, death, and memory. But now, he realized that the answers weren't something to be found in words or rituals. They were something deeper, something that could only be felt. He reached for the small marigold garland that had been resting beside him on the table. It had been with him through the whole journey, the color, the scent, the presence of the flowers reminding him of the spirits he had walked with. He had seen them, felt them, understood that they were not gone, but simply waiting, walking beside him in the quiet moments, in the flickering light of candles, in the scent of marigolds. Ezra stood and walked to the window, looking out over the town. The streets were peaceful now, empty of the crowds that had filled them the night before. Yet, the presence of the celebration, the energy of the spirits, still lingered, like a memory that wouldn't fade. He felt the pull of the lake again, the deep, tranquil water that had carried him to Janitzio, to the heart of the celebration. He had come here to learn, but what he had found was something more precious. It was the realization that the spirits didn't just return once a year. They were always present, walking beside the living, guiding them, reminding them of the paths that had been traveled, the stories that had been shared. Ezra grabbed his camera and his notebook and walked out into the streets of Pátzcuaro. There was no specific place to go. No agenda. Just a need to walk, to experience, to carry the lessons he had learned. The town felt different now. More alive, somehow. The people he passed on the street greeted him with smiles, nodding in acknowledgement, as if they knew the journey he had taken. It was as if the town itself had wrapped its arms around him, had invited him into its story. He passed by the church, its doors still open, the altar now empty but still illuminated by the soft glow of the candles that remained. He stopped for a moment, gazing at the simple beauty of the space. The altar was quiet, the offerings no longer there, but the memory of the night before lingered in the air. The spirits had come, had been welcomed, and had returned to their resting places. But they had left something behind, a feeling, a sense of peace, of connection. Ezra walked slowly toward the lake, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, he had a life to return to, a journey to continue. But Pátzcuaro, and everything it had shown him, would stay with him. He could feel the spirits in every step, in every breath. They were with him, always. Not just in the past, but in the present. In the moments between. As he reached the lake's edge, he paused, looking out at the calm water. The boat from the night before was still moored nearby, a small silhouette against the rising sun. The same boat that had carried him across to Genizio, the same boat that had taken him to the heart of the celebration. The boat that had carried him between the living and the dead. Ezra sat down on the edge of the dock, his feet dipping into the cool water. He pulled out his notebook and began to write, the words flowing easily now, as if they had always been there, waiting for him to understand. The dead walk with us, not as ghosts, but as memories. They are the light in the darkness, the whispers in the wind, the song in the silence. And they are never truly gone, not as long as we remember them. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him. The journey was not over. It had only just begun. Ezra knew now that he wasn't just a traveler passing through. He was part of the story. Part of the fabric of life and death, a thread woven into the tapestry of memory and love. And wherever he went, he would carry Pátzcuaro with him, its people, its spirits, its marigolds forever. As he stood and turned to leave the dock, he felt the presence of the spirits beside him. They were walking with him, side by side, just as they had walked with the people of Pátzcuaro. And he realized that they would always be with him, guiding him, teaching him, as he continued his journey. Ezra's departure from Pátzcuaro felt more like a continuation than a conclusion. The lessons of the town, the night of remembrance, and the silent presence of the spirits had seeped into his soul, leaving a mark he knew would never fade. As the bus rumbled away from the town, he gazed out the window, watching the familiar sights of Pátzcuaro recede into the distance: the church, the plazas, the lake that shimmered under the early morning light. But something had changed. Pátzcuaro was no longer just a place he had visited, it had become part of him, a story he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The spirits, the altars, the marigolds, and the music, they weren't just memories of a celebration. They were a living part of his journey, woven into the very fabric of his being. The bus ride was long, and Ezra found himself thinking about what came next. He had come to Pátzcuaro to learn, to understand the meaning of life, death, and memory, and in doing so, he had discovered something much deeper. The connection between the living and the dead was not just about rituals or traditions, it was about the way we carry each other's stories, the way we honor what came before, and the way we keep those stories alive in the present. Ezra had seen how the people of Pátzcuaro lived with their dead, how they walked side by side with them, how they made space for them in their lives. And he realized that he could do the same. He could carry the stories of his loved ones, the memories of those who had passed, and let them guide him, just as the spirits had guided the people of Pátzcuaro. When the bus finally arrived at his destination, Ezra stepped off and into the bustling city. The noise and chaos of the urban world felt like a sharp contrast to the peacefulness of Pátzcuaro. But as he walked through the busy streets, he carried the quiet with him, the stillness of the night he had spent among the spirits. Ezra returned to his work as a photographer, but he was no longer the same person who had first stepped off the plane to Mexico. The images he captured now held more than just a visual record, they held stories, emotions, and memories. Each photograph was an offering, a way of remembering, a way of carrying the past into the present. He found himself capturing more intimate moments, small gestures of love and connection, the quiet beauty of a forgotten corner, the light that danced on the edges of a smile. And as he traveled, he began to notice something. The spirits weren't just in Pátzcuaro. They were everywhere. In the laughter of a child, in the soft touch of a hand, in the stories passed down through generations. They were in the living just as much as they were in the dead. One evening, as Ezra sat in a small cafe in a foreign city, he took out his notebook and began to write again. The words flowed easily, as they always did when he felt connected to something deeper. He wrote, "We are all part of the same story, walking side by side, living and dying, remembering and forgetting. And as we walk, we carry the past with us, not as a burden, but as a light that guides us." He paused, reading the words over and over, letting them sink in. It wasn't just a message for himself. It was a message for the world to remember that the dead are never truly gone. They live in us, in the stories we share, in the love we carry, in the light we pass on. Ezra looked up from his notebook, his gaze drifting to the street outside. The world was bustling, moving, alive with energy. But in that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was part of something larger, part of the ongoing story of life, death, and memory. He finished his coffee and stood up, stepping back into the rhythm of the world. But this time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like he belonged, like he was walking side by side with the spirits, with the stories, with the memories. And as he walked into the busy streets of the city, he knew that he would never truly be alone. Because the dead walked with him, in every photograph he took, in every story he shared, in every breath he took. And that was enough. Months had passed since Ezra's time in Pátzcuaro, but the lessons he had learned there, the spirits he had walked with, and the quiet peace that had settled in his heart never faded. If anything, they had become more vivid with each passing day, a constant companion as he navigated the complexities of life in the bustling world beyond a small town. Now, back in the rhythm of his work, Ezra felt a deeper connection to the moments he captured through his lens. Each photograph was a reminder, not just of the world around him, but of the eternal presence of those who had walked before. He had come to understand that the stories of the dead were as much a part of life as the stories of the living. And in the quiet spaces between his photographs, he could almost hear their voices, soft whispers carried on the wind, carried in the way the light fell across a landscape, in the way a stranger's eyes caught his and held his gaze for just a moment too long. But it wasn't just in his work that he felt this connection. It was in the ordinary moments, 2 moments when the world felt like it was holding its breath, when the weight of the past seemed to linger in the air. One afternoon, as he walked through a park in the city, Ezra paused beside a small fountain. It was a quiet corner of the park, surrounded by towering trees that filtered the sunlight, creating dappled patterns on the ground. As he sat on the edge of the fountain, he could hear the soft sound of water trickling, the rustling of leaves, and the distant murmur of people talking, but it all felt far away, as if he were no longer fully part of the world around him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds and the light wash over him. And there, in the stillness, he heard it, the faint whisper of a voice, a memory. They are always with you. It was a voice he recognized, though he had never heard it spoken aloud. It was the voice of the spirits, of the ancestors, of the people he had met in Pátzcuaro. He had come to realize that they were not confined to a specific place or time. They lived in the stories, in the memories, in the hearts of those who carried their legacy. Ezra opened his eyes and smiled, feeling a sense of warmth in his chest. It wasn't just nostalgia, not just a longing for a place or time. It was the realization that the spirits, the lessons of life and death, were with him in every step he took, in every corner of the world he visited, in every moment of connection he experienced. He stood up, stretching his legs, and began to walk through the park, letting his mind drift with the rhythm of his steps. As he moved through the city, past the bustling streets, the sounds of traffic, and the sea of people, he began to understand that this was the true gift Pátzcuaro had given him. It wasn't just a lesson about death. It was a lesson about how to live. The next day, Ezra found himself back at the church in Pátzcuaro, standing in front of the altar once again. The air was thick with the scent of marigolds and incense, and the soft glow of candles filled the room. But this time, he wasn't just observing. He was participating. He lit a candle, placing it on the altar beside the others. As he did, he felt the weight of the moment, the quiet reverence, the understanding that this act, this offering, was not just a ritual. It was a living connection to the past, to the spirits who had walked before him, to the memories of those who had shaped him. Ezra stood there for a long time, watching the candle flicker in the soft light, feeling the presence of the spirits around him. They were not ghosts, not specters. They were the stories, the memories, the love that had been passed down through generations. And they were still alive in the hearts of the living. He took a deep breath and whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for those who had come before, for those who had shaped the world he now walked. And as he did, he felt something shift within him, something that had been waiting to be understood. The dead and the living were not separate. They were intertwined, like the threads of a tapestry, woven together to create something larger than the individual. Life and death were not opposites, but partners. And it was through this understanding that Ezra realized his true purpose: to carry the stories, the memories, the love, and the lessons of the past forward, so that they could continue to guide the future. As he stepped outside the church, the soft light of the early morning sun bathed the town in a warm glow. The streets were still, the air cool with the promise of a new day. Ezra smiled, knowing that he would carry the lessons of Pátzcuaro with him, wherever he went. And so, as he walked through the streets, through the world, he understood that the journey he had begun had no end. It was not about finding answers or reaching a destination. It was about living with the stories, living with the memories, and letting the spirits guide him through the path ahead. Ezra's journey had come full circle, though it was far from over. The realization that life and death were not opposing forces but parts of the same cycle had deeply transformed him. What began as a search for understanding had blossomed into a way of life. The lessons he had learned in Pátzcuaro, where the spirits of the past walked beside the living, continued to guide him in ways he had never imagined. He had come to see the world as an intricate tapestry woven not only from moments of joy and sorrow but from the memories of those who had gone before. He had returned to his life as a photographer, but the images he captured were no longer just pictures. They were stories, memories, and moments of connection. Each photograph held more than just light and shadow, it held the spirit of life, of the past, and of those who had walked before. Ezra no longer viewed his work as merely a reflection of the world. He saw it as a way to honor it by remembering, by holding on to what mattered. But life had a way of presenting new challenges, and soon Ezra found himself caught in a whirlwind of new experiences, new places, and new stories. He had continued his travels, moving between cities and countries, but it was in the quiet moments, when he took time to reflect, that he felt the most connected to the spirits. He often found himself back at the altar in his small apartment, lighting a candle, offering a prayer to those who had passed, and letting the silence fill the space. It was his way of staying grounded, of remembering where he had come from. One evening, after a long day of shooting in a crowded marketplace, Ezra found himself wandering the streets of a city he hadn't visited before. The streets were bustling, the air heavy with the sounds of life, laughter, music, the clink of coins, the bustle of people moving in and out of shops. But amid the noise, Ezra felt the familiar presence of something deeper, something that tugged at his soul. It was a small shop, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, where the noise of the street seemed to fade. The sign above the door was faded, but the words Curiosidades y Recuerdos were still legible, and it beckoned him in. Ezra stepped inside, feeling as if something had called him here. The shop was filled with old relics, photographs, trinkets, antique items, and framed letters all stacked high on shelves. There was a sense of history in the room, a presence of the past waiting to be discovered. As he moved through the narrow aisles, his eyes caught a glimpse of something on the far wall, a small, old wooden box, its surface worn with time. It stood out not because of its beauty, but because of the energy that seemed to radiate from it. Ezra couldn't explain it, but he felt a pull toward it, as though it was waiting for him. He walked over to the box and picked it up carefully. It was heavy in his hands, and as he opened it, he was greeted with the sight of old letters, yellowed with age, and a small photograph of a family, a man and a woman, their faces full of life and joy. The image was familiar, though he couldn't place where he had seen it before. The woman's face seemed to call to him, and there was a sensation of déjà vu, as if the memory of this family had always existed in the back of his mind. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a kind smile, noticed his interest and approached. "It's an old memory box," the man said. "It belonged to a family from here. They left long ago, but their stories remain. The box is full of their lives, the letters, the photographs, the small moments they wanted to keep." Ezra turned the box over in his hands, the weight of it grounding him. "Who were they?" he asked quietly, his voice almost lost amid the hum of the bustling shop. "They were the heart of this town," the shopkeeper replied, his voice softening. "But like all stories, they fade. People leave, and the memories become something to be treasured, passed down to others who will carry them forward." Ezra looked at the photograph again, feeling a deep sense of connection to the family, even though he had never met them. He realized that their story, like all stories, was part of something larger, something that connected everyone, from one generation to the next. "I'll take it," Ezra said, his voice steady but full of meaning. He had learned that the past didn't just belong to the dead, it belonged to the living, too. And in that moment, he knew that this box, this family's memories, were now part of his journey as well. The shopkeeper nodded, and with a smile, he wrapped the box carefully. As Ezra left the shop, he felt a sense of fulfillment, as if he had discovered a missing piece of his own story. The dead were never truly gone. They lived on in the objects they left behind, in the memories they had shared, and in the stories that were passed down. Later that night, Ezra sat at his desk, the box in front of him. He opened the letters one by one, reading the words written by people long gone. They were simple, tender words, letters to family, to friends, to loved ones. They were memories of a life lived, and in reading them, Ezra realized that he was not just an observer. He was a part of the story, a keeper of memories, just as the people of Pátzcuaro had shown him. He smiled to himself, knowing that his journey was far from over. There were more stories to be discovered, more connections to be made. The world was full of memories, full of lives lived, full of spirits that walked beside him. And he would carry them all with him, through his photographs, through his stories, through the way he lived his life. In the quiet of his apartment, Ezra made a promise to himself not just to remember, but to share the stories he had learned, to keep the memories alive, to pass them down to the next generation. And in doing so, he would continue the cycle of life and death, of remembrance and love, forever. Ezra's life had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. What began as a simple exploration of the spiritual traditions of Dia de los Muertos had evolved into a deep journey of understanding life, memory, and death itself. His time in Pátzcuaro had given him a unique perspective of belief that the dead did not simply disappear, but lived on in the stories and memories of the living. Since returning, he had felt a strong sense of responsibility to carry those stories forward, to be the keeper of memories that stretched across time and generations. But now, as he sat alone in his studio apartment, the box of letters and photographs before him, Ezra could sense that the weight of this role was both a blessing and a burden. The memories he had inherited were not just his own, they were the stories of the people who had come before him, and he felt an overwhelming need to preserve them, to make sure they were never forgotten. This responsibility, though, was not something that could be rushed. It was a quiet, long-term project, one that needed patience, time, and most of all, reverence. One day, as he was reviewing the letters again, each one written in delicate handwriting, the ink faded with time, Ezra came across a letter that struck him. It was an unsigned letter, its edges frayed as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. The handwriting was strong and determined, but the words carried a deep sorrow. The letter read, "To those who remain, know this, we carry the weight of those who have passed not as a burden, but as a treasure. Our memories are the bridge, the connection between life and death. And while they may have left their bodies behind, their spirits walk with us every day. Hold on to them. Cherish them. For when we are gone, it will be your turn to carry the torch. Ezra felt the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. This was the core of what he had learned in Pátzcuaro. The living and the dead were not separate, and the memories of those who had passed on were a gift, not a grief. They were to be cherished, passed down, and shared. Each memory, each photograph, each letter was a thread in the fabric of a story that would continue, even after the physical body was gone. As Ezra continued to read the letters, he felt his connection to the family in the photograph grow stronger. He could almost hear their voices now, whispers from the past, urging him to continue the work he had started. He had come to Pátzcuaro seeking understanding, and now he had found his purpose, to be a keeper of stories, to honor the memory of those who had shaped the world and the lives that had been touched by them. The photograph of the family remained on his desk, its edges curling with age, but its image still sharp and clear. Ezra had never met them, and yet, they had become a part of him. As he stared at the photograph, he saw the man and woman laughing together, their faces bright with joy, their eyes filled with life. And yet, he knew that the moment captured in that image was only one of many. It was a single memory in a life that was now long gone. Ezra had learned that memories didn't fade, they simply became part of the landscape woven into the fabric of time, slipping into the spaces between moments, waiting to be remembered again. And it was in these memories, in these moments that lived beyond the present, that the true meaning of Dia de los Muertos became clear. It was not a celebration of death, but a celebration of life, of the connections we make, the love we share, and the stories we carry forward. Determined to honor the gift he had been given, Ezra set out to find a way to share these stories. He wasn't sure how, but he knew it had to be done. The photographs, the letters, the memories, he would turn them into something tangible, something that would carry the essence of the people who had lived and loved before him. He contacted an old friend, a writer he had worked with on several projects in the past. Together, they began to compile the stories Ezra had collected, weaving them into a narrative that would transcend time. They began to craft a book, one that would tell not just the story of this family but of all the families that had been touched by the same cycle of life and death, of memory and love. It wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about making sure those stories lived on, making sure they were carried forward for future generations. As they worked, Ezra began to notice something strange. The more they delved into the stories, the more he felt the presence of the people who had lived them. It wasn't just the family from the photograph anymore. It was the people they had known, their friends, their ancestors, their spirits. They were all there, in the stories, in the words, in the photographs. Ezra could hear their voices, faint at first, but growing stronger as the project progressed. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, reviewing the draft of the book, he heard it again, the faint whisper of a voice. This time, he didn't jump or hesitate. He simply listened. "You are doing well," the voice said. "This is how we live on. This is how we stay with you, even after we are gone." Ezra smiled to himself. He didn't need to see the spirits anymore. He could feel them, hear them in the quiet moments between his thoughts, in the spaces between breaths. They were with him, always. And he would continue to carry their stories forward, as the keeper of memories, as the living bridge between the past and the future. As he closed the manuscript, Ezra looked at the family's photograph once again. It was no longer just an image of strangers. It was a symbol of the connection between life and death, of the love that transcended time, and of the stories that lived on, passed down through the generations. Ezra had become not just a photographer, not just a traveler, but a storyteller. And as he looked out the window at the city lights stretching out before him, he knew that his journey was far from over. He had learned that the dead were never truly gone. They lived on in the stories we told, in the memories we held, and in the love we carried forward. Ezra had fully embraced his role as a keeper of stories. The project that had started with a simple collection of photographs and letters had grown into something much larger, something that had become an essential part of his life. He no longer just took photographs, he captured memories. He didn't just listen to the voices of the dead, he recorded them, turning their fleeting whispers into lasting echoes. Each moment he spent writing, photographing, or piecing together the stories of the past felt like a thread he was weaving into a greater tapestry, a living archive of those who had gone before. It had been several months since the project began, and Ezra found himself deeply immersed in the process. The book he had begun with his old friend, a writer, had taken shape, and soon they found themselves working on not just a collection of stories, but a living chronicle. They would travel to different places, interviewing families, gathering more stories, more photographs, and more pieces of history. But despite all the work, there were moments when Ezra felt the weight of the task. The responsibility was enormous. He wasn't just telling stories, he was preserving lives, memories of people who no longer had a physical presence in the world. And with each new family they interviewed, he felt a deeper connection, a stronger sense of urgency to carry the torch and make sure that the spirits, the souls of those he'd never met, would live on. One chilly evening, as Ezra sat in his apartment reviewing the transcripts from a recent interview, he found himself lost in thought. The stories of the families he had met were not just memories of the past, they were alive in the present. The faces of the people they had interviewed seemed to appear before him in the quiet of the night, and he could almost hear their voices, the way they described their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents. He thought of the woman who had invited him into her home in Pátzcuaro, the elderly woman who had spoken of her brother, who had passed away many years ago, yet was still present in her life. She had told him that the spirits didn't just return once a year, they were always there, walking beside the living, sharing in their joys and sorrows. And the more he worked, the more Ezra understood that she had been right. The dead weren't just memories. They were living forces that shaped the present. The stories they left behind, the letters, the photographs, the heirlooms were not just relics, they were part of a living conversation. They were links in an endless chain of life, death, and rebirth. As the days passed, Ezra found himself more connected to the people he had met, even those whose faces were only visible in photographs. The stories began to fill his dreams, the voices he had heard in interviews mingling with the whispers of his own ancestors. The world around him became a tapestry of memories, stories, and connections, past, present, and future woven together in a way that felt both overwhelming and beautiful. But it wasn't just the stories of others that filled his mind. Ezra found himself reflecting on his own life, the memories of his family, the people he had lost, the faces that still haunted his heart. He had been so focused on preserving the stories of others that he hadn't allowed himself to fully process the ones that lived within him. The grief, the loss, and the connections that had shaped him. One evening, as he walked through the city after a long day of interviews, he found himself standing in front of an old cemetery. The gate was open, and the stone path leading inside seemed to call to him. He stood there for a moment, the weight of the stories he had heard pressing on his chest. It was as though the spirits were calling to him, asking him to remember not just the stories of others, but his own. He stepped through the gate and walked slowly down the path, his footsteps soft on the earth. The cemetery was peaceful, quiet, filled with old headstones that had been weathered by time. Some were nearly unreadable, while others stood tall and proud, etched with the names of those who had once lived. Ezra stopped at a small plot near the back, where an old stone marker stood with a name he recognized. It was his grandmother's grave. Ezra had never been close to her. She had passed away when he was young, but he had always carried her memory with him. He had often wondered about her, about who she had been before she became just a name in a photograph. But now, standing here in the quiet of the cemetery, he realized that her story was just as important as the ones he had been collecting. She had lived a life, had loved, had lost, and had shaped the world in ways he could never fully understand. Ezra knelt beside the grave, the weight of the moment settling over him. He wasn't just mourning her loss, he was honoring her memory. He was part of her story, just as he was part of the stories of the families he had been interviewing. He reached into his bag and pulled out his notebook, writing quietly in the soft glow of the setting sun. The dead walk with us, not in shadow but in light. Their memories are our guiding stars, their stories our inheritance. And it is through our stories that we keep them alive. The words flowed easily, as if they had always been waiting to be written. He felt the presence of his grandmother, of all those who had come before him, surrounding him in that moment. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of the story. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ezra stood and looked at the grave once more. It was as if the spirits of his ancestors were smiling down at him, grateful that their stories were being carried forward, that their memories would live on in the work he was doing. He knew now that he couldn't stop. He couldn't just take photographs and write stories. He had to live with them, walk with them, carry them with him. His work was not just a job. It was a calling. Ezra turned away from the grave and walked back down the path, the weight of the stories on his shoulders now feeling like a lightness, a purpose. The world was full of memories, and it was his task to keep them alive. To be the keeper of stories. And in that moment, as he stepped back into the busy streets of the city, he realized that the spirits were never far away. They were with him in every photograph he took, in every story he told, in every connection he made. And in the quiet moments of reflection, in the stillness of the night, they would always walk beside him, guiding him on his path. Ezra stood at the edge of a new journey, gazing out over the city that had become his home for the past few years. His time in Pátzcuaro had been the beginning, the spark that ignited a passion he hadn't fully understood until now. His work, the stories, the photographs, had all led him here, to this moment, where everything seemed to come together in a way that felt like a quiet resolution. He had never imagined that his life would turn into a constant journey of preservation, of storytelling, of remembering. When he first set out on his travels, all he had wanted was to capture the beauty of the world through his lens. But what he had found instead was something far deeper, a way to honor the past, to keep it alive, to intertwine the stories of the dead with the lives of the living. Now, as he stood in his apartment, looking at the finished manuscript of his book, Ezra felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The work was done, at least, this chapter of it. The stories were written, the photographs captured, the voices of those who had passed and those who had lived had been immortalized in a way that no time, no distance, could erase. And yet, there was no sense of finality. Ezra had come to understand that stories were never truly finished. They lived on in the people who remembered them, in the hearts of those who carried them forward. The book he had written, the one that had started as a project but had grown into something much more personal, was just one part of the larger tapestry of life. The dead were never gone, they lived on in the memories, in the stories passed down, in the photographs that remained. And the living. They carried the weight of that legacy, the gift of remembering, with them into the future. As he turned the pages of the manuscript one last time, Ezra felt the weight of the journey he had taken. He thought of the families he had interviewed, of the photographs he had captured, of the memories he had been entrusted with. He thought of the spirits who had walked beside him, guiding him, teaching him. He thought of Pátzcuaro, and of the people who had shown him how to honor the past and embrace the present. And in that moment, he understood. It was never just about the work. It was about the connections, the way stories bridged the gap between the living and the dead. It was about the love that flowed through those stories, the way they brought people together, and the way they created a sense of continuity, of belonging. Ezra had become part of that bridge, part of that cycle, just as those who had come before him had been. His phone rang, snapping him out of his reverie. It was the writer he had worked with on the book. They had just received confirmation that the first batch of books was ready for distribution. Ezra smiled as he answered the call, feeling a surge of excitement mixed with a deep sense of fulfillment. "Hey, Ezra. It's done." The writer's voice echoed through the phone. "We did it. The book is finally here. All those stories, those memories, they're out in the world now. It's incredible." Ezra chuckled softly, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's more than just a book. It's a way to honor the people who shared their lives with us. To make sure their stories live on." "That's exactly it," the writer agreed. "You know, I was thinking about what you said during our last meeting about how the spirits are always with us. And when I look at the finished manuscript, it feels like they are. It's like they're standing beside us, helping us carry this forward." Ezra paused for a moment, letting the weight of the words sink in. He had spoken about the spirits often, but hearing it now, hearing it from someone else, felt like a confirmation of everything he had come to believe. The spirits were indeed always with him, always with all of them. They lived on, not just in the past, but in the present. In the work they did. In the lives they touched. "Thank you," Ezra said quietly, "for helping me bring this to life. For helping me tell their stories. I couldn't have done it without you." The writer's voice softened. "We did it together. And now, the world gets to hear those stories. The world gets to see what we've seen, the beauty, the love, the lessons that have been passed down through generations." Ezra hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, the manuscript resting before him. The weight of it no longer felt heavy. Instead, it felt light, like a page had turned, a chapter had ended, but there was always another waiting. The stories would never end. They would continue, passed from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. Ezra had learned that the essence of life was not just in living, but in remembering, in carrying forward the stories that shaped the world. And as long as he could, he would be the keeper of those stories. He would walk with the dead, just as the living walked beside him, and together, they would keep the memory of those who came before alive. The city outside his window continued to pulse with life, but Ezra felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place in the world not just as a photographer, but as a storyteller. And in that role, he had discovered that the greatest gift was not in taking photographs, but in sharing the stories of those who had lived before him, and in doing so, ensuring that they would never truly be gone. He stood, walked over to the window, and looked out at the horizon. The world was vast, full of stories, full of memories waiting to be told. And he knew, with certainty, that his journey had only just begun. The spirits would walk with him. They would guide him. And he would carry their stories forward, for as long as he could. Epilogue, The Living Tapestry. Ezra continued his work as a photographer and storyteller, but now, each photograph he took, each story he told, was a tribute to those who had come before. The world was full of memories, full of love, full of connections. And through his work, he had learned that the dead are never truly gone. They live on in the stories we tell, in the love we carry, in the memories we pass on. And in every memory, every story, Ezra found his own place woven into the tapestry of life, death, and memory. A living part of something far greater than himself. The end of one story was never the end. It was merely the beginning of another. And Ezra would continue to walk that path, with the spirits of the past walking beside him, guiding him, and reminding him that every story, every life is a thread that connects us all.